they needed picking up. So,
Them kids, you gotta love them.
All right, let's see if this is going to work. I'll tell you, you sure look old when you see yourself on camera. I don't like it at all. This timeline, it's all just on one piece. This is really easier to read than the other one I had printed out. It's actually, I forget, 68 pages of this thing. This is pretty good. It does really help get it all in perspective. We're going to look in 2 Chronicles tonight, though, about Hezekiah. Let me get my... Yeah. Because the 2 Kings account of Hezekiah doesn't even get... It hardly touches on any of the good stuff. So we're going to touch on the good stuff tonight. And then when we look at this, we do get a kind of a perspective as to you going to survive there, buddy? We'll get a perspective as to why the passages in 2 Kings, why the king of Assyria was so attracted to taking Judah and why they were so confident in God protecting them. And then we'll also see, I think, when we get to that point where Hezekiah kind of shows off the treasury to his representatives, why he may have had no doubt that that was not in danger. And so we often look at that, and the historians that write about it look at that as a grave error, which it was. But I think there's a level of innocence or something about it. Anyway, we're going to look at that when we get to it. Tonight we're going to look at 29, which this portion is just almost a repeat. The first part of this is a repeat, very briefly, of what we looked at last week. But then it gets into some really significant material. So that's 2 Chronicles chapter 29. And before we continue, Kevin, you asked about the proportions for that cross. Right there on that piece of paper is what I used when I built those three crosses out there.
I'm sorry, here, let me fix this. And you said?
Yeah, and I said that's the cross. You have to do a little math to figure that out. But
alrighty.
But that's the.
Oh, by the way, thank you for putting that fixture on. I've got the feed line in the truck. I probably can go ahead and take care of that right away.
Okay. All right. So, verse 1, Hezekiah was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, which is different than what's in Kings, but we've talked about that before, how different traditions use different names. Sometimes they use the Jewish name, sometimes they use a different name. He did what was right in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestor David did. In the first year of his reign, in the first month. So this is as soon as he actually becomes co-regent with his father. He's co-regent for a while with his father, means he shares kingship. This is the first month that he is king on his own. Okay, 25 years old. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the Lord's temple and repaired them. Then he brought in the priests and the Levites and gathered them in the eastern public square. So get this picture. During the reign of his father and previous kings, the temple was in such disrepair you couldn't open the doors. Okay, couldn't get into place. So the first thing he does as soon as he's king is gain access to the temple. Then, a temple's no good without priests and Levites. So, Then he brought the priests and Levites and gathered them to the eastern public square, which was would have been on the eastern side. Yeah, you would have had part of the city on that side. And he said to them, "Hear me, Levites, consecrate yourselves now and consecrate the temple of the Lord, the God of your ancestors." So this word consecrate is much like the word holy. In fact, it means to be holy. The literal meaning of it in Hebrew is to have your hands full, which is a weird way to think about consecration. But what that meant was, if your hands were full, there was room for nothing else. So you were totally devoted to God because you had no room for anything else in your life. That's what consecration meant. And so in a life like that, you were totally of use to the one thing that you were serving. And in this case, it was God. So he said, consecrate yourselves now and consecrate the temple. So make it so that it is only useful to God, the God of your ancestors. Remove anything impure from the holy place. Which, what was going on there before, we've read about already. His father was burning incense to Baal and Asherah in God's temple. So he says, remove all of those things. For our ancestors were unfaithful and did what is evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They abandoned him, turned their faces away from the Lord's dwelling place, and turned their backs on him. So the very thing that was told to Asa way back, if you seek God, he will allow himself to be found by you. But if you disrespect or if you reject God, he's going to reject you. So now we're seeing in full form exactly what the prophet was trying to say to Asa. Because now it's been lived out in real time in his ancestors. So they also closed the doors of the portico, which was the outer gate, extinguished the lamps and did not burn incense and did not offer burnt offerings in the holy place of the God of Israel. So he's saying there was no worship at all going on in the temple. Therefore, he's explaining, the wrath of the Lord was on Judah and Jerusalem, and he made them an object of terror, horror, and mockery, as you see with your own eyes. So what is he describing here? He's describing that because this happened, and we turned our back on God, God hasn't punished them. He's just made them a mockery. They don't have any strength left. They don't have any power left. They're being threatened by the Assyrians, who have already proven to be too much for their northern brothers and sisters. And nothing is looking good for the country at this point. He says, our fathers fell by the sword, and our sons, and our daughters, and our wives are in captivity because of this. Now he's speaking of those that were in the northern kingdom. So Hezekiah has a broad view of who his people are. He's not just focused on the people of Judah. He's speaking to the Levites and the priests. There we go. Sorry about that. Anyway, we'll carry on.
Are we supposed to be seeing you?
Oh, no, wait a minute. I don't want you to see me. Enough's enough. Supposed to be seeing this in just a minute. We're actually looking at you now.
Now, so we're going to be...
You and your little hood. Okay, there we are. We're back. Everything's like it's supposed to be. Okay. Only that's in the wrong...
It's going to be 29.
I know. I'm getting there, darling. Stop all this foolishness. All right. Okay. Microsoft is so rude. Just interrupt what we're doing for an update. All right. So he says, consecrate yourselves. All right. There was a rule. There were laws for that. There was a process that Moses had laid out for how a priest or a Levite was to consecrate themselves before God. So that's what he's referring to. Consecrate yourself, and then you consecrate the temple. There was also a process for that. At the very beginning, when the temple was dedicated, God laid out exactly how that was supposed to happen. They knew what that was, and that's what he's telling them to do. And then it involves this, removing the impure from the holy place. For our ancestors were unfaithful and did what was evil in the sight of our God. They abandoned him, turned their faces away from the Lord's dwelling place, and turned their backs on him. They also closed the doors of the portico, extinguished the lamps, did not burn incense, and did not offer burnt offerings in the holy place of the God of Israel. Therefore the wrath of the Lord was on Judah and Jerusalem, and he made them the object of terror, horror, and mockery, as you've seen with your own eyes. Our fathers fell by the sword, our sons, our daughters, as they were carried off into captivity. It is in my heart now. Now that word heart comes up again later. It's a significant. This is not a legalistic activity for Hezekiah, and we find later that it's not a legalistic activity for God either. So we're discovering some things that are important that actually Jeremiah builds on in his prophecies later. So there's a movement really that's going on, a movement of God that is kind of refocusing what this whole relationship with God is to be. So he says, it is in my heart now to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his burning anger may turn away from us. So this is what he desires. He wants a covenant with God. All right. Covenants with God before were totally God's responsibility. There was nothing that Abraham did as a part of his covenant. There was nothing that David did as a part of the covenant with God. Nothing that Noah did that was part of the covenant with God. God just did it all. And so what Hezekiah is actually saying here, that it is in his heart to have this covenant made with God. He's ready for God to act.
That's in verse 10?
In verse 10, yes.
That's weird that my Bible doesn't use the word
What's,
heart.
it doesn't? What's it use?
It just says, now I intend to make a covenant, and leaves it at that with the Lord.
Yeah, I don't know why they do
I know,
that.
that's crazy.
Because, well, let me see something here. Yes, definitely there.
Because
That's part of the Hebrew.
it
Let me
would
see.
mean it's more intense.
Yeah.
In your
Yeah.
Bible
Yeah, and that's the word it uses
than.
for heart. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to find the English translation because they just all got different ways of doing it. Yeah, so it's in his heart to do this, and he's ready for God to act, and he knows that in order for God to act, he needs to do all that he can to turn the people back to God. That's what God is looking for.
Goes back to what you were always saying about how that the action of faith has to take place first.
Yes, and when faith is relationship oriented, then you know that you're acting in faith, because that's why we you often have trouble with people that say I just don't have enough faith, because what they're saying is I'm not getting what I'm expecting, so I must not have enough faith. Well, if faith is the motivation to secure the relationship with God, then you're not measuring or identifying your faith by what occurs outside of the relationship. Once you're in the relationship, God may have a totally different idea about what is needed in your life or to occur through your life so that he can act through it. And it may not have anything to do with what you're expecting. That's why we ask in his name, Jesus says. We don't just ask for anything. We ask in his name, and when we're doing that, all that we're pursuing is what God wants out of it. And so that's where he's trying to get his people back, because they haven't practiced this type of worship in many, many years. So imagine in your life, for instance, you go through a period of time and you've got fervent prayer, fervent worship, and you're active in it, and then it's not that you quit, it's taken away from you for 30, 40, 50 years. And then all of a sudden somebody shows back up and says, okay, you can go back to worshiping again the way you did before. That would be a difficult place to find yourself. How do I go back to that? Who's going to be here to help me remember how that was? Who here can... Well, that's what Hezekiah is trying to do here. And as we will see, it wasn't easy to do. So he goes on. He says, my sons, talking to the priests and Levites, don't be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand in his presence and serve him, and to be ministers and burners of incense. So here we have, he's speaking to the priest, and he's saying, this is what you are destined for, is to stand in his presence in the temple and to serve him and to minister, meaning on behalf of the people. And the burning of incense was the first step. Okay. So then we get into this place of cleansing the temple. So then the Levites stand up, and I'm not going through these names because it's embarrassing for me to try to speak these names. But these are the ones that are chosen, and the commentary that I use to kind of look over these names, most of the people that are listed here are either Korathites or they're sons of Korathites. So the Korathites have become the predominant clan of priests that are prevalent in Jerusalem at the time. So they gathered their brothers together, all these gentlemen that are mentioned ahead. They consecrated themselves and went according to the king's command by the words of the Lord to cleanse the Lord's temple. So the king has told them to do this, but their guidebook for doing it is the law of Moses. All right. So they do this in a very orderly fashion. And reading through this, I became impressed by it because we should develop a process when we feel like that we've kind of slipped away from God. We should notice that there is sort of a process that we may need to go through, and this kind of describes it. The priests went to the entrance of the Lord's temple to cleanse it. They took all the unclean things they found in the Lord's sanctuary in the court to the courtyard of the Lord's temple. So this is the outer court that they're in, and so they start from the outside and they just start cleaning everything that's to the doorway. So that's their job. And actually, this translation says priest. I think it's more referring to Levites than it is the priest at this point. Then it says, then the Levites received them all the things that were unclean, is what it's talking about, and took them outside to the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley's become a location like the garbage dump. If you recall, that's where some of the human sacrifices had occurred, and every time they would, Asa, as a matter of fact, when he cut down all the Asherah poles, he carried them all to the Kidron Valley, and that's where they were set on fire. And so the Kidron Valley's become kind of this trash heap for the city. So they took them outside, the Levites did. They began the consecration on the first day of the first month. And on the 8th day of the month, they came to the portico of the Lord's temple. So now they're approaching where they can go inside the temple. They consecrated the Lord's temple for 8 days, and on the 16th day of the first month they finished. So for 16 days, this troop of Levites and priests went through and they cleaned the temple. They consecrated the temple. Put it exactly the way it would need to be for worship. Then they went inside to King Hezekiah and said, "We have cleansed the whole temple of the Lord, the altar of burnt offerings and all its utensils, and the table for the rows of the bread of presence and all its utensils. We have set up and consecrated all the utensils that King Ahaz rejected during his reign when he became unfaithful. They are in front of the altar of the Lord." So you recall that all these things had been made holy, and Ahaz took them and used them for unholy purposes. So they've gone back now. What was left, they've consecrated in the way that the law requires so that it's useful again. And we know why that it was made unuseful, and it's because of Hezekiah's father had just ruined it all. All right, so the temple's set, and so far we know that there are some Levites and some priests that have consecrated themselves, set themselves aside again as holy. So now at least they have a place to worship, the place that God has assigned, and they have their priest ready to take their stations to lead the people in worship. So next, that's what they're going to do. And this is pretty cool. So King Hezekiah got up early, gathered the city officials, and went to the Lord's temple. They brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 male goats as a sin offering for the kingdom, for the sanctuary, and for Judah. So they have an intention now of they're going to offer a sacrifice as a way of overcoming the sin that had been brought upon not only the people, but also the sanctuary, okay, and also the kingdom. Judah is one portion of the kingdom, but as I mentioned, Hezekiah has an expanded view of what God is doing in his people, the entire kingdom, all the children of Israel. So then he told the descendants of Aaron, the priest, to offer them on the altar of the Lord. So they slaughtered the bulls, and the priest received the blood and splattered it on the altar. They meaning either the priest or the Levites. We'll discover why later. They slaughtered the rams and splattered the blood on the altar. They slaughtered the lambs and splattered the blood on the altar. This is what the sacrifice offering was meant for. Then they brought the goats for the sin offering right into the presence of the king and the congregation, who laid their hands on them. So part of the Day of Atonement was they would bring in goat, right? And one goat was sacrificed, and one goat became the scapegoat. Okay, so they laid their hands on these goats to signify the sins of the people were being transferred from them to the goat, and then it was dealt with. All right. So they brought the goats for the sin offering right into the presence of the king and the congregation, who laid their hands on them. The priests slaughtered the goats and put their blood on the altar for a sin offering to make atonement for all Israel. The broad view. For the king said that the burnt offering and sin offering were for all Israel. So he doesn't have it in his mind at all that anything that God is doing in this is for only a portion of his people. When God set all this in motion in the desert, it was for all his people. When David and Solomon conducted their business in the tabernacle and the temple, it was for all the people. And Hezekiah really does see himself as a David revivalist, where he's going to bring about a proper worship and proper life in the nation under God. All right. So Hezekiah stationed the Levites in the Lord's temple with cymbals and harps and lyres, according to the command of David, Gad, the king's seer, and then the prophet Nathan. So all of this was the way David had conducted worship. For the command was from the Lord through his prophets The Levites stood with the instruments of David and the priests with their trumpets. So you'll hear David referred to a lot because his intention here is to revive that kind of life in Israel. Then Hezekiah ordered that the burnt offerings be offered on the altar. So they have slaughtered the sacrifice for the burnt offering, and they've splattered the blood. Okay, now it is time to offer those animals in the fire. When the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord and the trumpets began. We don't know what the song of the Lord is. Well, we know it's a song of David, so you can pick a lot of them, I guess. The song of the Lord and the trumpets began, accompanied by the instruments of King David of Israel. The whole assembly was worshiping, singing the song, and blowing the trumpets. All this continued until the burnt offerings were completed. So you've got these 28 animals that are being consumed in the fire for burnt offering. This went on a while. This was no 3 songs and sit down and wait for the preacher to preach. They worshiped for a long time as this was going on. It says, when the burnt offerings were completed, the king and all those present with him bowed down in worship. So that was just a prelude. That made it possible for them. That covered their sin, took care of their sin. So now they could bow personally before God and they could worship. Then King Hezekiah and the officials told the Levites to sing praise to the Lord in the words of David and the seer Asaph. So they sang praises with rejoicing and knelt low in worship. Do you get the process here? The greater community, first of all, they're all together. And it would have been nearly pointless to do this without the community there. Had it been just a representative of them, it would not have accomplished anything that Hezekiah knew God was about in this form of worship. God intended to unite his people in his presence with the one thing that they will do from now to eternity, and that is to worship him. That is his desire. Not that he has to have worship in order to be God, but that is the relationship that we have with him. We can't be in relationship with him outside of worship. That's just the truth. And so that's what's going on there. So the whole nation had to be together. Otherwise, it does not accomplish what God wants to accomplish. Same thing in a church. I'm sorry to say, you can't achieve what God is achieving in a church if a fourth of the people are here. What you discover in the New Testament is that whoever's present is the church. Everybody else that's out is outside the church because God's church is gathered. Now it scatters between the times that he calls the church together to worship. Now in the New Testament, it was every day. They worshiped together every day.
Well,
okay?
This had to take weeks.
Oh yeah, we've discovered this takes a long time. And what also happens in this is that every time someone brought a sacrifice to be offered, they blew the horns and everybody could come and be a part of it. All right? So some sacrifices were just meant to be consumed in the fire. Others were meant, like I talked about at Thanksgiving, as a Thanksgiving sacrifice that was to be shared with folks. Okay? You had all these different ways, but every time somebody came with one, horn blew, and those that had a heart intent on that came, and they were a part of that. Okay? But the opportunity was there every time. Okay. So what he is doing when David initiated worship in the tabernacle, it was for all of Jerusalem. When Solomon initiated worship in the temple, it was for all of Jerusalem. Exactly the way God intended it when he began it in the desert, where they had nowhere else to go but to worship. So the sin offering has been offered, okay, and completely consumed before God. And it was after the sin had been thoroughly dealt with that they're able to bow before God and worship Him. So the relationship that God is after happens only after the sin is dealt with. Same thing as what we believe. We deal with our sin through Christ Jesus, and that opens the door through the throne room of grace, and we have a relationship with God. We can't have it outside of that, because it is the sin sacrifice that's offered for us. So it's the same thing. Now, the expectation of communal worship hasn't changed from the Old to the New Testament. That's why the writer of Hebrews says what? Encourage one another to continue to meet together. Because some have stopped meeting together, and they understood the destruction that could cause. Same thing here. And so what we'll find here in a minute is that Hezekiah is after the kind of worship that's going to bring back the rest of Israel to home. This is the beginning spot of making everything right again. Can't do it without worship. Worship is the hitch pin in the whole thing, and we have to honor it. So in verse 31, Hezekiah concluded, "So now you are consecrated to the Lord." He's talking to the people here. They've been made right to them. So the priest and the Levites were consecrated. Then the temple was consecrated. Then there was worship. Now the people are consecrated. Come near and bring sacrifices and thanksgiving offerings to the Lord's temple. So now they're invited to join in on this worship. Up till now, everything's been provided by others, but now their sin is taken care of. They have this relationship with God that's open and free now. So now they're able to bring their gifts as a matter of sacrifice. So the congregation brought sacrifices and thanksgiving offerings, and all those who, with willing hearts, brought burnt offerings. The number of burnt offerings the congregation brought was 70 bulls, 100 rams, 200 lambs. All these were for a burnt offering to the Lord. 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep and goats were consecrated. So we've got just stable after stable full of animals ready to be offered to God as a means of fellowship, thanksgiving, burnt offerings, various offerings. Now this is verse 34 is key. However, since there was not enough priests, they weren't able to skin all the burnt offerings, so their Levite brothers helped them until the work was finished and until the priests consecrated themselves. For the Levites were more conscientious to consecrate themselves than the priests were. So the writer throws a little jab at the priest. They really weren't taking this revival too serious. All right? They'd been out of business a long time. And so here comes Hezekiah, and they're probably thinking that to go through the pain, it really wasn't pain, but it required a lot to consecrate yourself. You had to wash in a certain way. Your clothes had to be washed in a certain way. All these things had to be done in a certain way in order to be consecrated. And what the writer's saying is the Levites were more eager to do this than the priests were. So as a result, revival broke out, and there weren't enough preachers. Revival broke out, and there weren't enough ministers. There weren't enough priests to handle the load. And so the Levites, who were also consecrated, had to step in. It wasn't necessarily their job, although they did. The law did give them permission to do that kind of work before God. But there just simply wasn't enough priests. Then it goes on. Furthermore, the burnt offerings were abundant, along with the fat of the fellowship offerings and with the drink offerings for the burnt offering. So there was a lot of work for the priests and the Levites to do to act as the mediators between God and these worshipers. Now that's a good problem to have. To have so much worship occurring that you can't keep up because there's not enough servants to do it. I'm not going to preach about the church right now, but But we're all called to be priests to one another and to a lost world. So our greatest relationship with one another in the church is in the moment that we worship. So worship is the greatest opportunity we have for fellowship, for service, for relationship. Everything that can occur in a church can occur in worship. Okay? It depends on how much time and how much effort you want to invest into it. So sometimes an hour may not get it done. Sometimes all afternoon may not get it done. African American churches understand this better than us. They'll start at 10 in the morning, go to 4 in the afternoon. You better have packed a lunch because there's no stopping. Because it is a moment that they may not have until that time next week. Probably won't. But they view it as they may not ever have it again. And so they take full advantage. So the service of the Lord's temple was established, meaning that this was the kind of thing that could go on all the time now. Well, I think I lost my...
Well, I think what I get out of this total worship that they're doing is unlike what Isaiah describes in chapter 1, being empty. This is intentional, and it's heartfelt, and it's not forced.
This, in fact,
this is good, pure, natural worship.
Isaiah writes chapter 1 during this period. Most everybody believes that that's what's going on with Isaiah. Mm-hmm. That he is formulating what is written in the first part of Isaiah during this time when Hezekiah is king. So yeah, you can't read Isaiah linearly because you'll get all messed up with what's really going on. But yeah, that's exactly right. Most every commentator you'll read will connect Isaiah 1 to what's going on here. So, then Hezekiah sent word throughout all Israel and Judah, so the northern and southern kingdom. And he also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, which was the border. These were the border tribes between the northern and southern kingdom, to come to the Lord's temple in Jerusalem to observe the Passover of the Lord, the God of Israel. For the king and his officials and the entire congregation in Jerusalem decided to observe the Passover of the Lord in the second month, because they were not able to observe it at the appropriate time, which would have been the first month. But they didn't have the temple clean and consecrated until the 16th day. And so there was no time to prepare properly for the Passover. So now they've said, well, let's just do it the second month. And so the first thing is, man, is God going to allow that? Because he's pretty strict in his law about when to do this. And he's already proven that he's a stickler about following the law, because you remember the priest's sons reached out and just touched the Ark of the Covenant to keep it from falling over, and they dropped dead. So what's fixing to happen, Is he going to strike the whole nation down for doing this in the wrong month? Because they just couldn't do it before. So not enough of the priests were consecrated by then, and the people hadn't been gathered together in Jerusalem. So they really couldn't do it because the temple wasn't ready. There wasn't enough priests, and the people really didn't have a clue as to what was going on yet, really. But the proposal pleased the king and the congregation, so they affirmed the proposal and spread the message throughout all Israel, from Beersheba to Dan, from the northwest all the way to the southeast, to come to observe the Passover of the Lord, the God of Israel in Jerusalem, for they hadn't observed it often as prescribed, or they were supposed to. So, they're breaking the law. They're going to have Passover in the second month rather than the first month. So the couriers went throughout Israel and Judah with letters from the hand of the king, and his officials, and according to the king's command, saying, Israelites, return to the Lord and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, so that he may return to those of you who remain, who have escaped the grasp of the kings of Israel. So this is what he's saying. You return to God, and he's going to return to you. This has been the principle that's been spelled out ever since the beginning. It hasn't changed one bit. Don't be like your ancestors and your brothers who were unfaithful to the Lord, the God of their ancestors, so that he made them an object of horror, as you yourselves had seen. So what he's talking about there is, don't be like your brothers and sisters who were carried off into exile. What a terrible, horrible thing to do, to be separated from the land that God had given you and from the place of his worship. You're still here, and you still have the opportunity to turn to God. And to more than that, but to celebrate the Passover. It says, don't be obstinate now like your ancestors did. Give your allegiance to the Lord and come to his sanctuary that he has consecrated forever. Serve the Lord your God so that he may turn his burning anger away from you. For when you return to the Lord, your brothers and your sons will receive mercy in the presence of their captors and will return to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful. He will not turn his face away from you if you return to him. So this is beautiful. He's saying, join us in this greatest time of worship for our people. It says, don't be hard-hearted and obstinate like your forefathers were. And when we do this, God's going to have mercy on those that have been carried off. He's going to let them come back. So he has this great, marvelous vision of a united kingdom again. And everybody being what Micah, who was also at this time, and that Isaiah shares the same language, that they'll sit under their own vine and fig tree and drink from their own cistern. That everything's going to be right in the world. And why? Because God's gracious and merciful. He's allowed for all this to happen, but he's relying upon the grace and mercy of God. So how do you know the grace and mercy of God? You know it when you've interacted with him, when you've got a relationship with him. It can't be out of a legalistic type of mechanical thing. So because Hezekiah is he's standing on the grace and mercy of God, he's really not worried about celebrating the Passover in the wrong month. It's not a part of his thinking. The only thing that's a part of his thinking is that God is gracious and merciful. He's going to understand what? My heart. All right? So, although the law is there, he understands that everything that was placed in the law was so that the heart of man and the heart of God could be turned to one another. That's what he keeps talking about here. And he's practicing that in worship and in how he is leading his country into worship. So the couriers traveled from city to city in the land of Ephraim and Manasseh as far as Zebulun, but the inhabitants laughed at them and mocked them. So these people in the north, Zebulun's farther to the north and east, if I remember. By now, the Assyrians have settled people from other countries into that part of Israel, and so they probably were laughing because they didn't know anything he's talking about. They didn't know anything about the God of Jacob or Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. So they were laughing. But some from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. So the narrator has the right idea about what's required from the worshiper, and he's setting the stage for that. It says, also the power of God was at work in Judah to unite them, to carry out the command of the king and his officials by the word of the Lord. So what's being recognized here? Is this the king that is accomplishing this great unification? No. It's God working. It's the power of God at work. And Hezekiah is recognizing that too. You never see him take credit for any of this. It's always turns back to the king and his officials by what? By the word of the Lord. Everything if they give Hezekiah credit at all, it's added because it's by the word of the Lord that he's doing these things. So a very large assembly of people was gathered in Jerusalem to observe the festival of the unleavened bread in the second month. So the festival of the unleavened bread was also the Passover festival. So Passover occurs at the end of the festival of unleavened bread. They proceeded to take away the altars that were in Jerusalem. So the altars that he's talking about are these altars to pagan gods or to idols. So evidently, what we read about in 1 Kings being some of the first things that happens, this is where it picks up in the story. They proceeded to take away the altars that were in Jerusalem, and they took away the incense altars and threw them into the Kidron Valley. They slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the second month. Now get this, the priests and Levites were ashamed, and they consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings to the Lord's temple. So what is that about? It just kind of throws that little tidbit in there in the second half of one verse. The priests and the Levites were ashamed. All right, they'd already been consecrated, some of them. But is this the ones that had not been? That had kind of been just laying back and kind of watching this whole thing unfold but not participating. Until finally they're ashamed of what they're doing. They're ashamed of who they've let themselves become before God and before the people. I think that that's the case that he's talking about here. Not when it says 15. It says the priest and the Levites, meaning all of them. I think it's talking about some of the priests and some of the Levites.
Got laid back. Lazy.
Yeah, lazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe suspicious of this whole thing.
Yeah.
Because it had not been a part.
People were more spiritual than them.
Yeah.
Understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. You can make a lot of parallels between modern church and what goes on in this whole episode.
Lack of participation.
Yeah. You're kind of just sitting back and saying, okay, let's see what this is really about. You know, who is this really about? What's really going to happen? You know, this. Yeah. Well, and they may have known enough of the story to wonder. Okay, the Passover lamb did what originally?
It spared them.
The death angel passed over.
Passed over.
And maybe they're reaching the point where they're thinking, boy, this is nothing to play around with. Is death going to come to me because I'm not taking this serious? Is what happened to the Egyptians going to happen to me because I'm kind of being obstinate and stiff-necked about what God's trying to do here? So maybe they had a kind of a, for lack of a better term, a come to Jesus meeting. And and said, maybe we need to change some things, and they did. It's better to be with God and operating in His will and what He wants than outside it. Period. I mean, that's kind of what's going on here. 16. They stood at their prescribed posts, so there were places that, according to the law of Moses, where it says, and then they make sure you know that Moses was the man of God. So the priests splattered the blood received from the Levites, for there were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves, and so the Levites were in charge of slaughtering the Passover lambs for every unclean person to consecrate the lamb of the Lord. So this, the lambs to the Lord. So this is what happened when you offered the Passover lamb. You had to go through a process of consecrating yourself so that you could offer it. Well, what this is saying is people are showing up unconsecrated and just offering the lamb. So the Levites are doing it on their behalf. All right, which is another big no-no. You didn't offer the lamb without first going through the process of being consecrated. All right, but it says a large number of the people, many from, look where they're from, Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, were ritually unclean. Yet they had eaten the Passover contrary to what was written. All right, so all these people from the north who had either come from the north or had settled in the south and had been without really any type of worship of Yahweh since way back. It had been a long time, and they probably had no idea of what was required.
But they didn't really care because they just wanted the relationship.
They
with
just
God.
wanted the relationship
So
with
they
God.
didn't care.
Yeah, yeah, and they may not have known.
Huh?
They may not have known, and God had made a provision
That's right.
with the Levites so that they could do this. So when people want to bark about God being a legalist and a moralist and all these things, they're not paying attention to what Scripture's saying here. Because God is more than willing to overlook the process that He has put in place to have a relationship when the relationship is there.
That's right. It's a matter of heart.
Yeah, that's right. And so Hezekiah had interceded for them, saying, "May the good Lord provide atonement on behalf of whoever sets his whole heart on seeking God, the Lord, the God of his ancestors, even though not according to the purification rules of the sanctuary." So here, the king takes on the role of a priest. So remember, we've talked about 3 ways that you become a mediator between God and his people. As a king, as a priest, or as a prophet, or a combination of any of those 3. And so Hezekiah is operating as a king and a priest at this point. He offers this priestly prayer. And so that these people can be protected, and because their whole heart is about seeking God. And so verse 20 says, so the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. So their lack of consecration, the narrator views as having some sort of disease, okay, a dis-ease before God. There was a thing that was wrong with them. They were unclean. And the way that they understand what happens through the process of consecration is that you are healed before God. So that when you are healed, you're made whole. So the whole heart seeking God brings about wholeness for your life. And that's a principle that follows all the way through the Bible, see.
Well, you see, now here there's submission and sacrifice, and it's not self-centered as where previously where the kings have taken over in the priesthood, it has been for the wrong motivation.
Correct. All of this is the whole heart turned to God. Hezekiah's heart's turned to God. The worshipers that have come unconsecrated, but still wanting a relationship with God, their hearts are turned to God. Later, Jeremiah writes about, God says, I'm not going to write these things on tablets of stone anymore. I'm going to write them on your heart. Okay, this is, you can begin to follow this thread all the way through to Jesus with no trouble at all. And that's where God is, in everything that he does, that is where he is intent on leading us anyway. So let's see. So the Lord heard Hezekiah and he healed the people. The Israelites who were present in Jerusalem observed the festival of the unleavened bread for 7 days with great joy. And the Levites and the priests praised the Lord day after day with loud instruments. So for 7 days, it is a worship and raucous going on. I mean, the whole town, you could hear it for miles, this worship that had broken out for God. Then Hezekiah, let's see, so 7 days with great joy. I don't want to skip something. Then Hezekiah encouraged all the Levites who performed skillfully before the Lord, They ate at the appointed festival for 7 days, sacrificing fellowship offerings and giving thanks to the Lord, the God of their ancestors. So, how did Hezekiah encourage the Levites? He makes sure that they are receiving the inheritance that Moses provided for them, which is they are partakers of all the gifts that are brought. And there's this abundance of gifts. And so for 7 days, they ate like Levites. They just had the best of everything because that's what God had ordered for them, because they didn't have any land. So, verse 23, the whole congregation, now this is the whole city, decided to observe 7 more days. So then they observed 7 days with joy, for King Hezekiah of Judah contributed 1,000 bulls and 7,000 sheep to the congregation. So for this next 7 days, King Hezekiah is the benefactor for their worship. He just provides all the food. He provides all the sacrifice so that they can just continue to worship. Let's see. Also, the officials contributed 1,000 bulls, 10,000 sheep for the congregation, and many priests consecrated themselves. So the priests are still in the process of getting on board. That's what this is communicating to us. These last holdouts are beginning to realize that this is a real deal. There's something going on here that they had never witnessed in their life, and many of them had never even heard stories about in their life. This goes all the way back to Solomon, before the kingdom was ever destroyed by his son and Jeroboam, son of Nebat. So this is as close to a Davidic revival for the country as they've ever had in their history. Then the whole assembly of Judah, with the priests and Levites, the whole assembly that came from Israel, the resident aliens who came from the land of Israel, and those who were living in Judah rejoiced. So everybody, rich, poor, north, south, aliens from other races that had been transferred in to live in the northern kingdom, they were all there, and they were all rejoicing in this worship. There was great rejoicing in Jerusalem, for nothing like this was known since the days of Solomon, son of David, the king of Israel. Then the priests and the Levites stood to bless the people, and God heard them, and their prayer came to his holy dwelling place in heaven. So this is the connection here. All right, so they've had this great worship. They've offered all these sacrifices, including fellowship offering that is really intended to bring God into their midst. And the priests stand and they bless the people, receive the power that is God's for your life under his will. That's the blessing that they receive. And the Levites offer it to them, and God hears it, and it's pleasing to them. So that the unification that has occurred both with the people, God is a part of that too, through the prayer and blessing that is offered by the Levites and the priests. So see what you miss out when you miss worship. It's hard to convince people that worship is not just an event and a date and time on a calendar. It is the hardest thing in the church to do. If they understood what God was about in worship, you would never, not dare, miss being with his people and being a part of that. You would rearrange everything about your life so that you did not cause that to get in the way to get in the way of your worship. Because that's the only intention God has through it, is for his relationship with his whole people to occur together. When you look at the individual type of occurrences that are recorded in the Bible with prophets and others, it's almost always because the people have just fallen away from God. God doesn't do a lot of that individual stuff with somebody when everything's good with the people. It always includes the whole people. And we've lost that. in the Western world, especially. We just take it or leave it because it's just something that we do on Sunday. And what does God do with that? I mean, really and truly, when you think about it, if it's in the heart, well, it's just a date and a time on the calendar. And so's, he preaches the same sermons every 3 years or something. I don't know. But it becomes just a thing where it's accomplishing none of what this is about. And to me, this is the greatest. You read a lot about worship in the Bible, but these actually 3 chapters are significant in the way that we should view our worship. Because God hasn't changed in it. He still has the same purposes in it that he's always had. All right, verse 31, we're going to kind of run through because a lot of this is names and duties, and we don't need to run through that. But I do want to look at portions of it. So it says, well, when all this was completed, all this worship, everything was right. They were unified and together, and just everything's looking good. All Israel who had attended went out to the cities of Judah and broke up the sacred pillars, chopped down all the Asherah poles, and tore down the high places and altars throughout Judah and Benjamin, as well as Ephraim and Manasseh, to the last one. Then all the Israelites returned to their cities, each to his own possession. So this big festival of worship is over. They've destroyed every object of idol worship. Okay, so you remember when we were reading about the Assyrian king saying, oh yeah, your God's mad at Hezekiah because he's tore down all the places where people go to worship, not understanding that was exactly what God wanted him to do. So when we see that dialogue, we see all kind of things that the Assyrian king doesn't understand what he's up against. And the result is what it is, where he ultimately winds up leaving and is killed. But they each go back, and the idea of going back to his own possession is important because they've been threatened under siege from a foreign nation that would take their land, but God had given them their possession, that what they possessed was accorded to them when Moses divided up the land amongst the 12 tribes. Okay, so what the statement is saying is they're this close to having the kind of peace that God wants for them, and it begins with settling in on what he had given them, their little portion of the land flowing with milk and honey, so that it was still theirs. And that's an important part of the genealogy and geography of the Old Testament. Doesn't last long, but for now, it is important. So Hezekiah reestablished the divisions of the priests and Levites for the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings, for ministry, for giving thanks, and for the praise in the gates of the camp of the Lord, each division corresponding to his service among the priests and Levites. So there was different places in the temple, different times of the day, where they rotated duties. So they were on duty. There was priest on duty almost all the time. And so that you could come and worship. That was the whole point of having them on duty all the time. The king contributed from his own possessions for the regular morning and evening burnt offerings, the burnt offerings of the Sabbaths, of the new moons, and of the appointed feast, as written in the law of the Lord. He told the people who lived in Jerusalem to give a contribution for the priests and the Levites, so that they could devote their energy to the law of the Lord. So this is what it was meant to be from the beginning. Moses said, you Levites, you have no inheritance. Your inheritance is the Lord's. Your brothers are going to feed you and keep you clothed and keep you out of the elements, so that you can concentrate on serving the Lord. So when the word spread, this is pretty cool, the Israelites gave liberally of the best of the grain, new wine, fresh oil, honey, which is not listed in the code, but this is something that they've developed as a part of their palate, I guess, where they were living, and all the produce of the field, and they brought it in an abundance, a tenth of everything. So what he's describing here is, He says, go and bring a contribution, and they all brought a tenth, which came out of the law as well. As for the Israelites and the Judahites who lived in the cities of Judah, they also brought a tenth of the herds and flocks, and a tenth of the dedicated things that were consecrated to the Lord their God. They gathered them into large piles. In the third month, they began building up the piles. So this is a month. This is a month, or just a few days after the Passover celebration, because it went on for 2 weeks. So in the third month, they began building up the piles, and they finished in the 7th month. So for 4 months, they gathered up this stuff. When Hezekiah and his officials came and viewed the piles, they blessed the Lord and the people of Israel. So it's an interesting idea to say that you've blessed the Lord, because usually when you talk about blessing another person, you're talking about bestowing upon them the power of God under His will, and to be blessed in that, to have that a part of your life. So to bless the Lord is ultimately saying that the way that we are living our life, we want to be a blessing to you. And so I think that's what that means. So they blessed the Lord, and they blessed the people. So Hezekiah asked the priests and the Levites about the piles. So the chief priest, Azariah, of the household of Zadok, answered him, since they began bringing the offering to the Lord's temple, we have been eating and are satisfied, and there is plenty left over, because the Lord has blessed His people. This abundance is what is left over. So Hezekiah told them to prepare chambers in the Lord's temple, and they prepared them. The offering, the tenth, and the dedicated things were brought faithfully. The Levite who was in charge of them, and his brother. So anyway, this is the beginning of building up the temple treasury again, and a stockpile of goods for the priests and the Levites, so that they can continue to serve the people as they came to worship in the temple. So let's see. Let's skip through all those names. And you get down to verse 20. So it says, Hezekiah did this throughout all of Judah. Everybody that was a priest or Levite that was recorded genealogically and that was older than the age of 3, 3 years old or older male that was a Levite or an Aaronite, a descendant of Aaron, they got a portion, of all the things that were coming in, and they were still in abundance. He did what was good and upright and true before the Lord his God. He was diligent in every deed that he began in the service of God's temple, in the instruction and the commands, in order to seek his God, and he prospered. So, we're back to the very things that God was teaching his people with Asa and before Asa. You seek God, he allows himself to be found, and in the process of that relationship, things go well. They prosper. In Asa's day, a huge army came against Asa, and instead of trying to take it on himself, he sought the Lord, and the Lord said, go sit on the hill and watch, and I'm going to take care of this. And so this is the same thing. Now we're going to find that it doesn't allow you to be stupid just because God's in the room. You still have to keep your wits about you. You still have to live with an awareness of what does God really think is prudent and right in a situation like this. Because I'm going to get a little ahead before next week. But when he shows off his stuff in the treasury, I really think that he felt like, well, God's provided this. There's no way it's ever going to be taken away. But the reason why he was showing it off was to, in some sort of way, gain favor. See? So he was using what was God's in order to somehow or another gain favor with the Assyrian king that was threatening him. And when that happened, God says, I can't be used that way. I can't be used for you to draw favor from one who is an
That's
enemy.
a bargaining chip.
Yeah. If Hezekiah's interaction was to be anything with a foreign leader, it was so that he could say to him, "Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near." Because that is what the people of Israel were to do with these foreign nations that were constantly at their doorstep trying to take over. But that's not what he does. So he does things right, but he's just not always smart about it. And we do the same thing. We can't point our finger at Hezekiah and say, "Boy."
But why would you? If you were Hezekiah and did all that right for so long and by the book, basically, why would you, what would make you not go that route, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think it's...
At what point did he lose his focus? I don't know.
And we'll get into... I think we'll discover some things. I think it just becomes a matter of, like some of what was relayed in this story, you just kind of get to where you take God for granted a little bit, I think, and all that he's done, and you begin to think about what's his as maybe that's mine, and then we kind of get lost in it.
He doesn't strike me as that type of king, though.
No, but it only takes one time,
No.
and I think that's what happened here. It was a one-time thing, and it's not like God destroyed him because of it. I mean, he got a disease, and God let him live another 15 years beyond that because he knew that he was going to be a good king during that time, and he was pretty
How
much.
old was he about this time? Do you know? You know everything.
I know I
I'm
don't.
sure you do.
No, I don't. I'll figure it out when we get there. We're not there yet. We got to get through the first one. So anyway. So you like that story about worship? You like that? I liked it. I haven't read that particular passage since I was in seminary when I was reading it for the assignment we had. It kind of brought back a lot of things that we dug out from there. We didn't go over half of it. But as it relates to the church, the corporate nature of worship has value beyond our comprehension. And the priest, and especially the priest, that were kind of slow to buy into it, they wound up having a view of themselves that was one of the worst that you could have in their culture, and that was shame. Shame's always been a problem throughout time, but in Scripture it takes on various degrees of reductionism, I guess. And I think that the other thing that had happened to those priests is they had probably become synchronistic in their religious practices, where they were trying to practice both, maybe some Yahweh worship and also worship of these other gods. And they may have just reached a point of utter confusion and didn't really know what to trust. And that happens in our lives too. We become reliant and dependent and more enamored by some things, and then God's kind of left. So we try to juggle both, and it really becomes a struggle to live a life like that. And we witness it in a lot of people's lives. You can see it in some people's lives. They're just really miserable in their life because they're trying to worship two things. And Jesus made it clear you can't worship God and you can't worship mammon or the things of the world.
Being double-minded.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. And so I think that's what some of this was, but they overcame it, and it didn't. The corporate worship, the strength of it, the activity of it, the joy of it, probably helped these priests overcome their obstinance toward it. Well, the same thing happens today. I mean, people in the church need what the church has for them as it comes to their relationship with God. I feed on it as a pastor. I feed on when the house is full and everybody's singing and there's nods and there's gestures and there's questions at the end of the day, and you think, man, God has really been at work here, and He's been honored in this. But it's not the same when there's 30 people in the room. Well, not that the numbers matter, but you know there's people missing. And when you know they're missing, I see all the people that aren't there. I don't see the people that are here, and that's bad. But because it has value, and I know that the people that are not there, they're the ones that are needing it most. And it was the same thing here. So the way that this works, when we come together and worship to God, hasn't changed in 6,000 years, really. And we still have a hard time figuring it out or making it real for us. And then the people that come that were not consecrated, in Jesus' day, they would have looked down their nose at them and threw them out of the temple. They would have never gotten through the door. So it had reached that point in Jesus' day because the religious leaders were desperate to try to uphold the legalism of the law so that there was at least something there. But the something that they were holding was a hammer that they were using on everybody else. And Jesus came and said, you don't understand what this was about. And the reason why you don't understand it is because you don't know the guy that put all this into place. You think you do, but you don't. And but Hezekiah understood it because his heart understood it. His heart, and he recognized the whole heart of those that had just come to worship. Anyway, that's all I got to say about that. Y'all got anything to say about that? Got any more questions I can't answer?
You didn't get all the tough questions.
Okay. She's always doing that to me. All right. Well, 3 people watched. Maybe it'll be worse.